The desert wind howled through the narrow streets of Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of another scorching day. It was the summer of 1885, and the small mining town sat like a forgotten jewel in the vast expanse of the American Southwest, where fortunes were made and lost with each strike of a pickaxe, and where justice often came at the end of a gun barrel. Jake Morrison had been wearing the deputy's badge for barely 6 months, but already the weight of it felt heavier than the Colt .45 hanging at his hip. At 24, he was young for a lawman in these parts, but Sheriff Coleman had seen something in the earnest farm boy from Kansas that reminded him of himself in younger days. Jake had come west seeking opportunity, like so many others, but had found purpose instead in keeping the peace, in a land where peace was as rare as water in the desert. Hey there, friend. Before we dive deeper into Jake's story, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button if you're enjoying this tale of the Old West. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I always love hearing from folks all across the country who share a passion for these frontier stories. The morning sun was already climbing high when Jake made his way down Main Street, his boots echoing against the wooden boardwalk. Copper Ridge was stirring to life around him. The blacksmith's hammer rang out its steady rhythm. The general store was opening its doors, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the rumble of ore wagons making their way down from the mines in the hills above town. But Jake's mind wasn't on his usual rounds that morning. Tonight was the night he'd been planning for weeks. The night he would finally ask Elena Rodriguez to be his wife. He'd saved every penny of his deputy's salary to buy the ring that now sat heavy in his vest pocket. A simple band of gold with a small diamond that had cost him 3 months' wages. Elena was worth every cent and more. Elena Rodriguez was the daughter of Don Carlos Rodriguez, one of the few Mexican landowners who had managed to hold on to his property after the territory had changed hands. She was beautiful in a way that made men stop and stare. Dark hair that caught the sunlight like silk, eyes the color of rich coffee, and a smile that could make even the hardest prospector forget his troubles. But it wasn't just her beauty that had captured Jake's heart. Elena had a spirit that burned as bright as the desert sun, a fierce independence that both challenged and enchanted him. Their courtship had been proper, conducted under the watchful eye of her father and the strict traditions of her family. Sunday walks after church, chaperoned visits on the Rodriguez ranch, stolen glances across the plaza during town celebrations. Jake had learned enough Spanish to court her properly, and Elena had taught him about her culture, her family's history in this land that had been theirs long before it became American territory. As Jake walked his beat that morning, checking in with the shopkeepers and nodding to the early risers, his thoughts kept drifting to the evening ahead. He'd arranged to meet Elena at the old mission ruins just outside of town, a place where they'd shared their first kiss under a canopy of desert stars. It seemed fitting that it should be the place where he asked her to share the rest of her life with him. The day passed slowly, each hour stretching like taffy in the desert heat. Jake tried to focus on his duties, but his mind kept wandering. He helped break up a minor dispute between 2 miners over a claim boundary, checked on old Mrs. Henderson who'd been feeling poorly, and made his usual rounds through the saloons to ensure things stayed peaceful. Sheriff Coleman noticed his distraction and clapped him on the shoulder with a knowing grin. "Son, you look like a man with something weighing on his mind," the older lawman said, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Wouldn't have anything to do with a certain senorita, would it?" Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. It's it that obvious, Sheriff? Only to someone who's been where you are. I remember when I asked my Martha to marry me, back in '62. Thought I was going to lose my breakfast right there on her daddy's front porch. Coleman's eyes grew distant for a moment, remembering his late wife. You got yourself a good woman there, Jake. Don't let her slip away. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jake finally allowed himself to head home to prepare for the evening. He lived in a small room above the barber shop, sparse but clean, with just enough space for a bed, a washstand, and a small table where he kept his few possessions. He washed carefully, shaved again, though he'd already shaved that morning, and put on his best shirt, the white cotton one Elena had complimented him on at the church social last month. The ring box felt enormous in his pocket as he made his way through the gathering dusk toward the mission ruins. The old Spanish mission had been abandoned for decades, its adobe walls crumbling slowly back into the earth from which they'd been made. But there was something peaceful about the place, something that spoke of endurance and faith that had drawn Jake and Elena there many times during their courtship. Elena was already waiting when he arrived, silhouetted against the last light of day. She wore a white dress that seemed to glow in the twilight, her dark hair loose around her shoulders instead of pinned up in her usual style. Jake's breath caught in his throat at the sight of her. She looked like an angel, like something too beautiful and pure for this harsh desert world. "Jake," she said softly as he approached, but there was something in her voice that made him pause, something that didn't match the romantic scene he'd imagined. "Elena, you look beautiful," he said, reaching for her hands. But as their fingers touched, he felt something wet and sticky. Looking down in the fading light, he saw dark stains on her palms, on her white dress, streaked across her arms like paint. But it wasn't paint. It was blood. Jake's training as a lawman kicked in immediately, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun, even as his heart screamed that this couldn't be real, couldn't be happening. "Elena, whose blood is this?" Her dark eyes met his, and in them he saw fear, desperation, and something else, a wildness he'd never seen before. "Jake, please," she whispered, stepping closer to him. "Please don't ask me that. Please don't make me tell you." "Elena, I have to know. If someone's been hurt, if there's been a crime." His voice trailed off as the implications hit him. The woman he loved, the woman he'd been about to propose to, stood before him covered in blood, with terror in her eyes. "No," she said firmly, her hands gripping his arms with surprising strength. "No, Jake, you don't have to know. You don't have to do anything. Just forget you saw this. Forget you were here tonight." Jake stared at her, his mind reeling. Everything he'd been taught about duty and justice warred with the love he felt for this woman. "Elena, I can't just ignore this. I'm a deputy. I took an oath. And I'm asking you to break it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For me, for us." The desert wind picked up around them, stirring the dust and making the ruins seem to whisper with the voices of the past. Jake looked into Elena's eyes, searching for some explanation, some way to make sense of what he was seeing. But all he found was desperation and a plea that cut straight to his heart. "Don't tell," she whispered. Rising up on her toes to bring her face close to his, "Please, Jake, don't tell anyone what you've seen." And then, before he could respond, before he could think or reason or remember his duty, she kissed him. Her lips were soft and warm against his, tasting of salt and fear and something else he couldn't name. It was a kiss filled with desperation, with love, with a plea that went deeper than words. When she pulled away, Jake felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The ring in his pocket felt like a stone, heavy and meaningless now. Everything he'd planned, everything he'd dreamed of, had changed in an instant. "Elena," he said hoarsely, "what have you done?" But she was already backing away from him, her white dress ghostly in the darkness that had fallen while they stood there. "I'm sorry, Jake. I'm so sorry. But I had to protect myself. I had to protect my family." "From what? From who?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face now. "I can't tell you. If I tell you, you'll have to choose between me and your badge, and I can't ask you to make that choice." "You already have," Jake said quietly, the weight of the moment settling on him like a physical burden. "The moment you came here with blood on your hands, you made me choose." Elena's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked like the young girl he'd first met at the church social, innocent and full of laughter. "I never wanted this, Jake. I never wanted to put you in this position. But I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Jake said, but even as he spoke the words, he wondered if he believed them. In his short time as a lawman, he'd already seen enough to know that sometimes people were backed into corners, with no good way out. "Not for women like me," Elena said bitterly. "Not for Mexican women in American territory. Not when powerful men decide they want what belongs to us." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. "What are you talking about?" But Elena was already moving away, disappearing into the shadows between the ruined walls. "I have to go, Jake. I have to leave Copper Ridge tonight. If you love me, if you ever loved me, you'll give me until morning before you tell anyone about this." "Elena, wait!" Jake called out, starting after her. But she was already gone, vanished into the darkness like a ghost. He stood alone among the ruins, the silence broken only by the whisper of wind through the crumbling adobe and the distant howl of a coyote, somewhere out in the vast desert. Jake remained there for a long time, staring at the spot where Elena had disappeared, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The ring in his pocket felt like an accusation now, a reminder of how naive he'd been to think that love could exist in a vacuum, separate from the harsh realities of the world around them. Finally, as the moon rose high overhead, casting the ruins in silver light, Jake made his way back toward town. But instead of going to his room above the barber shop, he found himself walking toward the sheriff's office. His hand was on the door handle when he stopped, Elena's words echoing in his mind. "If you love me, if you ever loved me, you'll give me until morning." Jake stood there for what felt like hours, his hand on the door, torn between duty and love, between the oath he'd taken and the woman who just shattered his world. In the end, he turned away from the office and walked slowly home, knowing that by morning, everything would be different. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat by his window, watching the street below, and thinking about Elena's words, about the blood on her hands, about the fear in her eyes. Somewhere out there in the darkness, she was running, and he was letting her go. As dawn broke over Copper Ridge, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Jake finally understood that some choices changed you forever, and he'd just made one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The next morning brought news that would confirm Jake's worst fears and force him to confront the full weight of his decision. Sheriff Coleman burst into the office just after sunrise, his face grim and his usual easy manner replaced by the hard edge of a man who'd seen too much violence in his years as a lawman. "Jake, we got ourselves a situation," Coleman said without preamble. "Thomas Blackwood's been found dead." Jake felt his blood turn to ice. Thomas Blackwood was one of the most powerful men in the territory, a railroad investor and land speculator who'd been buying up property around Copper Ridge for months. He was also a man with a reputation for getting what he wanted, regardless of who stood in his way. "Where?" Jake managed to ask, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "Out at the Rodriguez Ranch. Don Carlos found him this morning when he went to check on his cattle." Blackwood was lying in the arroyo behind the main house, throat cut clean through. Coleman's eyes were sharp as they studied Jake's face. "Funny thing is, Don Carlos says Blackwood had no business being on his land, says he'd told the man more than once to stay away." Jake's mind raced, pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place. Blackwood had been pressuring Mexican landowners to sell their property for months, using a combination of legal maneuvering and intimidation to force them out. The Rodriguez family had been one of the few to resist his advances. "Any witnesses?" Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. "That's the strange part," Coleman said, settling into his chair and fixing Jake with a steady stare. "Don Carlos says his daughter Elena left last night to visit her aunt in Tucson. Says she took the late stage, but the stage driver swears he didn't have any passengers last night, and the ticket agent says no one bought passage to Tucson." Jake felt the walls closing in around him. Elena had lied to her father about where she was going, which meant she'd planned her escape carefully. But it also meant that suspicion would fall on her quickly once the discrepancies in her story came to light. "Sheriff," Jake said carefully, "what do you think happened?" Coleman leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands steepled in front of him. "Well, son, I think Thomas Blackwood finally pushed the wrong person too far. Question is, who was it? Could have been Don Carlos himself. Man's got a temper when it comes to protecting his family and his land. Could have been one of the ranch hands. Or," he paused, his eyes never leaving Jake's face, "could have been someone else entirely." "What do you mean?" "I mean, Jake, that Thomas Blackwood had a reputation with women, particularly young, pretty women whose families he was trying to pressure into selling their land. There's been talk around town, whispers about him making unwelcome advances, using his position to force himself on women who couldn't fight back." Jake felt sick. The implications of Coleman's words hit him like a physical blow. If Blackwood had tried to force himself on Elena, if he'd threatened her or her family, "We need to talk to the Rodriguez family," Coleman continued. "And we need to find Elena. Even if she's innocent, she might have seen something, might know something that could help us find the real killer." "I'll ride out to the ranch," Jake said quickly, desperate to do something, anything, that might help Elena, or at least buy her more time. "No," Coleman said firmly. "I'll handle the Rodriguez family. You take a ride into town. See if anyone saw or heard anything unusual last night. Check with the hotel, the saloons, anywhere Blackwood might have been before he ended up dead in that arroyo." Jake wanted to argue, wanted to insist on being the one to question Elena's family, but he knew that would only raise suspicions. Instead, he nodded and headed for the door, his mind already working on how he could use his assignment to help Elena. The morning sun was climbing higher as Jake made his rounds through Copper Ridge, asking questions he already knew the answers to, going through the motions of an investigation, while his heart hammered against his ribs. At the hotel, he learned that Blackwood had been drinking heavily the night before, boasting to anyone who would listen about a business deal he was going to close that evening. At the Silver Dollar Saloon, the bartender remembered Blackwood leaving around 9 o'clock, saying he had an appointment to keep. Each piece of information painted a clearer picture of what had happened, and none of it was good for Elena. Blackwood had gone to the Rodriguez ranch with some kind of plan, probably involving Elena or her family. Something had gone wrong, and Elena had been forced to defend herself. Jake found himself at the telegraph office, staring at the key that could send a message to law enforcement in Tucson, alerting them to be on the lookout for Elena Rodriguez. His duty as a deputy demanded that he send that telegram. But his love for Elena and his growing understanding of what she must have endured stayed his hand. "Something I can help you with, deputy?" asked the telegraph operator, a thin man named Perkins, who'd been running the office since the lines had reached Copper Ridge. "Just checking to see if any messages came in about the Blackwood case," Jake said, improvising quickly. "Nothing yet," Perkins replied, "but I did send out that message Sheriff Coleman requested, alerting the authorities in Tucson to keep an eye out for the Rodriguez girl." Jake's heart sank. Coleman was already ahead of him, already closing the net around Elena. "When did you send that?" "About an hour ago. Should reach Tucson by this afternoon." Jake nodded and left the telegraph office, his mind racing. Elena had maybe a day's head start, but if she'd really taken the route toward Tucson, she'd be walking into a trap. Unless she was smarter than that. Unless she'd lied about her destination, just as she'd lied about taking the stage. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine police work that felt anything but routine. Jake interviewed shopkeepers and saloon patrons, collected statements and took notes, all while his thoughts remained focused on Elena and the impossible situation they both found themselves in. It was just after noon when Sheriff Coleman returned from the Rodriguez ranch, his face even grimmer than when he'd left. He found Jake in the office, writing up his morning's interviews. "Learn anything useful?" Coleman asked, settling heavily into his chair. "Blackwood was drinking heavily last night. Left the Silver Dollar around 9, saying he had an appointment. Hotel clerk says he seemed excited about some kind of business deal." Jake kept his voice steady, professional. "What about the ranch?" "Don Carlos is devastated," Coleman said, shaking his head. "Man's aged 10 years since yesterday. Says Elena left around 8 o'clock last night. Claims she was taking the stage to visit her aunt. But like I said, no one at the stage line remembers selling her a ticket. Maybe she changed her mind, decided to ride instead of taking the stage. Maybe, or maybe she had other plans entirely." Coleman pulled out a piece of paper from his vest pocket. "Found this in Blackwood's hotel room. It's a letter from his lawyer in Phoenix, outlining a strategy for forcing the Rodriguez family off their land. Seems Blackwood had discovered some irregularity in their land grant, something that could have been used to challenge their ownership in court." Jake felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. So he was planning to steal their ranch? Looks that way. And according to Don Carlos, Blackwood had been making increasingly aggressive overtures toward Elena, claiming that a marriage between them would solve all the family's legal problems. Coleman's voice was heavy with disgust. Man was old enough to be her father, and about as charming as a rattlesnake. So Elena might have killed him to protect herself and her family? That's one theory. Another is that Don Carlos finally had enough and took matters into his own hands. But the old man's got an alibi. He was in town until late last night, playing cards at the Silver Dollar. Plenty of witnesses. Jake's mind was working furiously. If Don Carlos had an alibi and Elena was missing, then she was the obvious suspect. Unless there was someone else, someone they hadn't considered. Sheriff, what if it wasn't Elena or her father? What if Blackwood had other enemies, other people he was trying to force off their land? Coleman nodded slowly. That's possible, son. Blackwood wasn't well liked around here. But the fact remains that he was found dead on Rodriguez land, and Elena Rodriguez is missing. Until we find her and hear her side of the story, she's our primary suspect. The afternoon brought more bad news. A rider came in from the Territorial Marshal's office, carrying orders to expand the search for Elena Rodriguez and offering a reward for information leading to her capture. Jake watched helplessly as wanted posters were printed and distributed. Elena's beautiful face staring out from the crude drawings like an accusation. As evening approached, Jake found himself back at the mission ruins, where his world had changed the night before. He stood in the same spot where Elena had kissed him, where she'd begged him not to tell, and tried to make sense of the choices that had led them both to this moment. The blood on her hands had been real. The fear in her eyes had been real. And now, as the full scope of Thomas Blackwood's plans became clear, Jake understood why she'd been so desperate, so terrified. She'd been trapped between a man who wanted to destroy her family and a legal system that offered her no protection. Jake pulled the engagement ring from his pocket, the small diamond catching the last light of the setting sun. He'd bought it with dreams of a future that now seemed impossible. Even if Elena was innocent, even if she'd killed Blackwood in self-defense, the scandal would follow them forever. And if she was guilty, he couldn't finish that thought. Instead, he closed his fist around the ring and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. The next morning, Jake Morrison walked into Sheriff Coleman's office and placed his badge on the desk. "I can't do this anymore, Sheriff," he said quietly. Coleman looked up from the reports he'd been reading, his weathered face showing no surprise. "This about the Rodriguez girl? It's about a lot of things, but yes, partly about her. You know something you're not telling me, son?" Jake met the older man's eyes steadily. "I know that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing. And I know that I can't be the one to hunt down a woman who was probably just trying to protect herself and her family." Coleman was quiet for a long moment, studying Jake's face. Finally, he picked up the badge and held it out. "Take a few days to think about it, Jake. This job, it changes a man. Makes you see things you wish you could unsee. Makes you make choices you never thought you'd have to make. But somebody's got to do it. Somebody's got to stand between the decent folks and the wolves." "Maybe," Jake said, not taking the badge. "But it doesn't have to be me." Jake left Copper Ridge that same day, riding south toward the Mexican border, with nothing but his horse, his gun, and the engagement ring he'd never had the chance to give. He told himself he wasn't looking for Elena, that he was just leaving a place that held too many painful memories. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was following his heart into the desert, chasing a ghost who'd kissed him with blood on her hands and changed his life forever. 3 days later, in a small cantina in a dusty border town whose name he never learned, Jake Morrison heard a familiar laugh. He turned, and there she was, Elena Rodriguez, her dark hair shorter now, and her clothes those of a common traveler rather than a rancher's daughter. She was serving drinks to a table of Mexican vaqueros, smiling and laughing as if she didn't have a care in the world. Their eyes met across the smoky room, and for a moment, time stopped. Then Elena's smile faded, replaced by the same fear he'd seen in her eyes that night at the mission ruins. Jake stood slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun, before he remembered that he was no longer a lawman. He was just a man in love with a woman who might be a killer. Elena said something to the vaqueros and walked toward him, her chin raised defiantly despite the fear in her eyes. "You came after me," she said when she reached his table. "I came after the truth," Jake replied. "And what truth is that?" Jake looked into her eyes, searching for the woman he'd fallen in love with, the woman he'd been ready to marry. The truth about what happened that night, the truth about Thomas Blackwood. Elena glanced around the cantina, then sat down across from him. "You want the truth? The truth is that Thomas Blackwood was a monster who thought he could take whatever he wanted. The truth is that he came to our ranch that night with papers that would have stolen our land and a proposition that would have made me his property along with it. So you killed him. So I defended myself." Elena's voice was steady, but Jake could see her hands trembling slightly. "He said if I didn't agree to marry him, he'd make sure my family lost everything. And when I refused, he tried to take by force what I wouldn't give willingly." Jake felt a cold rage building in his chest. "He attacked you." "He did more than attack me, Jake. He tore my dress. He put his hands on me. He told me that no one would believe a Mexican girl's word against his." Elena's voice broke slightly. "So I fought back. I grabbed the letter opener from my father's desk, and when he came at me again, She didn't need to finish. Jake could see it all in his mind. Elena fighting for her honor, for her life, for her family's future. A young woman with no other choice, facing a man who held all the power. "Why didn't you tell me this that night?" Jake asked. "Because I knew you'd have to choose between believing me and doing your duty. Because I knew that even if you believed me, others wouldn't. A Mexican woman's word against a powerful American businessman? In an American court?" Elena shook her head. "I would have hanged, and my family would have lost everything anyway." Jake reached across the table and took her hands in his. They were clean now, but he could still remember the feel of blood on her palms, the desperation in her kiss. "I believe you," he said simply. Elena's eyes filled with tears. "It doesn't matter now. I can never go back. I can never be the woman you fell in love with." "You're still that woman," Jake said firmly. "You're still the woman I want to marry." Elena stared at him in shock. "Jake, I'm a fugitive. I'm wanted for murder. Even if you believe I was defending myself, the law doesn't see it that way." Jake pulled the engagement ring from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. "Then we'll make a new life somewhere the law can't reach us. Mexico, California, maybe even South America. Somewhere we can start over. You'd give up everything for me? Your career, your future, your good name?" "I already have," Jake said. "I turned in my badge yesterday. I'm not a lawman anymore, Elena. I'm just a man who loves you." Elena picked up the ring with trembling fingers, holding it up to catch the light from the cantina's oil lamps. "Are you sure, Jake? Once we do this, there's no going back. We'll always be running, always looking over our shoulders." Jake stood and walked around the table, dropping to one knee beside her chair. The vaqueros at the nearby table noticed and began to cheer, thinking they were witnessing a romantic proposal rather than a fugitive's last chance at happiness. "Elena Rodriguez," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through the cantina. "Will you marry me?" Elena looked down at him. This man who'd given up everything to follow her into exile, who'd chosen love over duty and her over the law. Slowly, she slipped the ring onto her finger. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, for the cheering vaqueros to hear. "Yes, I'll marry you." The cantina erupted in celebration. the vaqueros buying rounds for everyone and calling for music. But Jake and Elena only had eyes for each other, two souls who'd found each other in the darkness and chosen to face whatever came next together. They were married 3 days later by a priest in a small village church, with the vaqueros from the cantina serving as witnesses. Elena wore a simple white dress bought from a local seamstress, and Jake wore his best shirt, the same one he'd worn the night his world had changed forever. As they exchanged vows in Spanish and English, promising to love and honor each other for better or worse, Jake thought about the choices that had brought them to this moment. He'd chosen love over duty, Elena over the law, and an uncertain future over a safe past. And as Elena kissed him at the altar, her lips soft and warm and free of the desperation that had marked their last kiss in the mission ruins, Jake knew he'd made the right choice. They disappeared into the vast expanse of Mexico, two fugitives from American justice who'd found something more valuable than safety or respectability. They'd found each other, and in a world that had tried to tear them apart, that was enough. Years later, in a small coastal town in Baja California, an American rancher named James Morrison and his wife Elena would be known for their kindness to travelers and their fierce devotion to each other. They never spoke of their past, never mentioned the blood that had once stained Elena's hands or the badge that Jake had left behind. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when the desert wind carried the scent of sage and memories, they would hold each other close and remember the night when love had proven stronger than law, when a desperate kiss had changed two lives forever. And in those moments, they knew that some choices, no matter how difficult, were worth making. Because sometimes, the only way to find justice is to leave the law behind and follow your heart into the unknown.